Hey guys, I'm Redeemed Zoomer. So about a month ago I put out this video, All Atheist Arguments Debunked in 10 Minutes, and it got way more attention than I thought it would. Tons and tons of very high-profile atheist YouTubers like Matt Dillahunty and Alex O'Connor of Cosmic Skeptic responded to it. Basically, a lot of people saying it was really bad arguments. And they're right, that video was bad. But there's a reason why it's bad, and the reason is not because there aren't good Christian responses to atheist arguments. If you go to Inspiring Philosophy's YouTube channel, you'll find great responses, much better than the ones I did. But my channel is not like his channel. What my channel is famous for is making very short, oversimplified explanations of religious things, like all Christian denominations explained in 10 minutes, or every book of the Bible explained in 15 minutes. And that sort of spawned a new style of YouTube videos with channels like The Paint Explainer and stuff, which is great, by the way. I think it's cool, the style of very short explanations with Comic Sans and symbols to represent things. Tons and tons of new channels have spawned off of that. But that's what my channel was for. So I thought, what if I do that but for atheist arguments? What if I do every Christian response to atheist arguments simplified and summarized in 10 minutes? But my 60 IQ brain didn't realize that an argument needs to be drawn out. An argument needs to consider all the sides and can't just be very hand-wavy and shortened and oversimplified. That defeats the whole purpose of an argument. The truth is, you could make an hour-long debate, a 2-hour-long debate for each of those arguments, or at least most of those arguments covered in that video. So what I'm going to give you guys today is a more in-depth version of all the Christian arguments, all the arguments for God, because not every argument in that video was actually an argument that I believed. Just the way a few days ago I made a video about all arguments for God explained, I don't necessarily use all those arguments for God. I'm just explaining what the arguments are, what the Christian arguments are. So in this video, I'm going to give you guys what I actually think about all the different Christian arguments, all the arguments for God. I'm going to be ranking all the arguments, and I'm going to do a bit more of an in-depth analysis of them, and I'm going to actually address the common atheist criticisms of them. So, a while ago, a different atheist YouTuber called Genetically Modified Skeptic made a tier list of arguments for God, ranking which ones he thinks are the most convincing and most easy to understand, and I actually thought that was a good idea, so I'm going to steal that idea, and I'm going to make my own tier list of arguments for God. So in F tier, we have Pascal's Wager. Genetically Modified Skeptic also put Pascal's Wager in F tier. I agree. Pascal's Wager basically says, if you believe in God and it turns out God is real, then that's good for you. You'll probably go to heaven. If you believe in God and God turns out not to be real, nothing happens to you. If you don't believe in God and it turns out God's not real, nothing happens to you. But if you don't believe in God and it turns out God is real, you might go to hell. So basically, the argument is that you have better chances of having a good afterlife if you believe in God, and there's no harm in believing in God, so why not do that? There's tons of problems. First of all, it's not even an argument for the existence of God. It's only an argument for belief in the existence of God. And second of all, it only really works if the only two options are Christian and atheist. But there's a lot of contradictory religions, like there's Christianity and Islam, which both generally say you need to believe in their specific beliefs to have eternal life, basically. So, Pascal's Wager doesn't work at all. I don't know of any serious Christians who even like to use Pascal's Wager. I agree that it goes in F tier, because it's not an argument at all. Now, E tier does not exist. It is not a real tier. I don't know why it appears on these things. You don't get E on a report card. It's A, B, C, D, and then F, which means fail. And then, of course, on these tier things, S means superior. So we're skipping E. So in D, I'm actually going to put the cosmological argument. I know that certain atheists actually think the cosmological argument is one of the better arguments for God. I don't know. I've just never really liked it. I feel like the cosmological argument relies too much on our intuitions about how the world works. For example, like everything that is in motion needs to be moved by something, so you need a first unmoved mover. And I do think the best person to articulate this is, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas, not just in the Summa Theologica, but Summa Contra Gentiles. That's the one book of Thomas Aquinas that I've read fully. is the first book of Summa Contra Gentiles, he does make a very compelling argument for God. He uses the cosmological argument, arguing for an unmoved mover, and then going from unmoved mover to then show how the all the attributes of God, like all-powerful, all-knowing, naturally flow from being an unmoved mover. So I think that argument, Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument, works perfectly if you already presuppose Aristotelian metaphysics. Because Thomas Aquinas was really just copying that argument from Aristotle, basically, and making it a bit more Christian. So Aristotelian metaphysics, the system developed by Aristotle, it's kind of a vindication of common sense in some ways. It's a metaphysics that is very in line with human common sense about how things work, and it is very in line with the physics of the day. It makes perfect sense in the physics of back then to say that everything that is in motion has something moving it and stuff. But modern quantum physics seems to call some of that into question. Because in modern quantum physics, I mean, I don't pretend to really understand quantum physics, but I know enough to know that quantum physics really undermines all of our common sense assumptions about how objects work and move and stuff. Like a particle could be in multiple places simultaneously. That undermines the classical understanding of what a physical body of something is. So my problem with the cosmological argument in general is it tries to argue for God based on material things, and I don't like to do that because our understanding of the material world is constantly changing, so I feel like we build a house of cards if we make an argument for God based on material things. Because something that Alex O'Connor said in my video, like, in my answering atheist arguments video, I said science cannot speak to whether or not God exists. And then Alex O'Connor was like, okay, then why does Redeem Zoomer in this video use the cosmological argument? And my response is I was not using the cosmological argument. I was just listing it as one of the arguments some Christians do use. I do not particularly like the cosmological argument. Also in D tier, we have the teleological argument. It's basically the argument from design. So the most common form of this is like intelligent design. Stephen Mayer, who I actually talked to once in person, he just visited a church I was attending. Stephen Mayer is a big advocate of intelligent design and stuff, that, you know, there's a lot of design in nature, there's too much complexity for it to have evolved naturally. And I don't like this because Darwinian evolution does explain the complexity in nature. Yes, there are some things that it's hard for Darwinian evolution to explain, but then you're doing a God of the gaps, and I don't want to ever do a God of the gaps. And I appreciate that Alex O'Connor recognized that I was avoiding the God of the gaps fallacy. For example, I don't personally understand how Darwinian evolution could explain the development of the eye, for example. It seems like there's too much irreducible complexity in the eye. But just because I don't understand it doesn't mean there is not a scientific explanation. If I say, I don't understand this, therefore God, then I'm doing the God of the gaps fallacy, which is not a good argument. If you just argue for God based on things science can't yet explain, then your reasons to believe in God will shrink as science gets more and more advanced, and that's never been the Christian way to do science. Christianity has always been the basis for science, not the gaps that science hasn't filled in yet. So one form of the teleological argument is sort of an intelligent design with biological things. There's another form of the teleological argument, which is the fine-tuning argument. And genetically modified skeptic actually considered this the best argument for God. Even though he's an atheist, I don't consider this a good argument. The fine-tuning argument basically says there's like 4 fundamental constants in our universe, and if they were like a trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a degree different, our whole universe would collapse in on itself. For example, if gravity was 1 hair stronger, if the gravitational constant was 1 hair stronger, our entire universe would collapse on itself, and there would be no life or stars or planets. It would all just, the Big Bang would recollapse into one singularity because gravity would pull everything together. But if gravity was 1 hair weaker, then there also wouldn't be any life or stars or planets because everything would just spread out too thin. It wouldn't be able to condense. I might be getting the science of that a bit off. That's just what I've heard. And yes, scientists admit that the universe does seem fine-tuned to support life, but here's the problem. What Stephen Hawking would say is there could be just infinite universes, and if there are infinite universes, then obviously some of them are going to have the conditions to support life. It's kind of like Earth has the conditions to support life, but there are billions and billions and billions of planets, so some of them are probably going to have the conditions to support life. So I'm not sure if I believe in the multiverse. I don't, they haven't proven nor disproven that, but that is very much a possibility. So you don't want to say there is something we don't understand, therefore God, if there is a very reasonable naturalistic possibility. And like I said, the teleological argument, just like the cosmological argument, is a form of arguing for God based on earthly or physical created realities, which I don't think we should do. All right, now, C tier, we have evidentialism. So, evidentialism is very convincing to the average person. I've seen far more people convinced of Christianity by studying the evidence for the resurrection of Christ than have been convinced based on some, I don't know, philosophical, cosmological, or ontological argument. So the evidential perspective is very convincing to people, but I just don't think it's a good argument because I don't think someone's salvation should depend on their ability to like do historical analysis and find evidence for things. There's also evidence of modern things like demonic possessions and near-death experiences. And you know, if you talk to any Caribbean person, any person from the Caribbean will tell you that demons are real. It's a very Western Eurocentric thing to say that the supernatural never really happens. In other parts of the world, it happens so much that the average person would be silly to deny it. And it makes sense. Like, if demons are real, it would make sense for them to do that. Here's why. The biggest problem, the biggest threat to Christianity in the West is atheism, basically. Secular atheism is a big threat to the West. So if demons started manifesting themselves powerfully in the West, everyone would run to church, which is not what the demons want, because, you know, the West is a historically Christian land. By the way, if atheists are, I already can hear the atheists typing in all caps in the comments section. I'm just saying, from a Christian perspective, it would make sense that demons would manifest themselves more in non-historically Christian lands than historically Christian lands. I think you can at least agree with that, if you assume Christianity is true, which I know you don't. I'm just saying that does explain to me, as a Christian, why people of other cultures like the Caribbean, where there's like voodoo and stuff, why they have much more personal experiences of the demonic than in the West. So evidentialism, it can work, and there's also evidence of some other things, like some people try to look for evidence of like Noah's flood or whatever. I don't know. I'm not that into that stuff because, like I said, someone's salvation shouldn't depend on their ability to dig through historical documents. That's also kind of why I'm not convinced by the arguments for Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy being the one true church, by the way, because they both have like equally convincing historical arguments. So at the end of the day, from their perspective, someone's salvation depends on their ability to privately judge which historical arguments have more weight. The next one is personal experience. Now, this is kind of the biggest reason I believe in God. One of the two. This plus another one I'm going to get to is the biggest reason I believe in God. Like, I've personally experienced things that are unexplainable without God. But that's not going to convince anyone else. Personal experience is very good for convincing oneself that God exists. But very bad for convincing anyone else because it's personal. No one can step into the shoes of someone else's personal experience. So I would say it's C tier. I'm surprised Genetically Modified Skeptic put it in A tier. Maybe he was doing that. Maybe he was doing that in order to say, like, the best arguments that religious people have are from personal experience, but I don't think that's true. Okay, so now we get into B tier. So the moral argument I'd put in B tier. I think the moral argument is a pretty good argument. I think most atheist philosophers would agree that morality is not objective if God does not exist. And even if atheists may claim that morality is subjective, almost nobody really believes it. Almost everyone has this sense and lives as if morality is objective. Now, just because belief in God can epistemologically justify objective morality, that doesn't mean religious people will always agree on what's moral. The atheist could say that Christians have disagreed on slavery, which they absolutely have. Christians have disagreed on many moral issues. Religious people of all kinds have disagreed on moral issues. But if you believe in God, you at least have a foundation to say morals are objective, and therefore we can impose morals on other people. The moral argument is basically, you know, because people on Earth disagree what right and wrong is, then can something be objectively right or wrong? The only way it can be objectively right or wrong is if there is supreme authority, which is what we would call God. Like, in a culture, like, let's say 90% of a culture believes it is good and right to horribly persecute the 10%. You would have the majority agreeing on a certain moral value. Would that make it right? Most people instinctively would say no. So I think the moral argument is a pretty good argument for God. Now, the atheist could say that, yes, even if we feel like morality is objective, that doesn't mean it's true. Like one of the fallacies, or maybe it's one of the cognitive biases, is like a just world hypothesis. Just because like we feel it ought to be true doesn't mean it is true. And they have a good point there. Next is from consciousness. Now, I went over in my video about the arguments for God. Consciousness and the experience of being, just aware is irreducible. You cannot study it scientifically. Now, it is God of the gaps when you try to use God or the supernatural. I don't think this is really an argument for God. I think it's more an argument for the human soul. It is God of the gaps if you try to use something supernatural to fill in the gaps of what science hasn't discovered yet. But consciousness is something that science, by definition, cannot answer. It's not just that science does not yet have an answer to human consciousness. It's that science cannot answer the question of human consciousness. Yes, science can study the brain, and science can study the brain chemicals, that brain chemicals correlate to feeling certain things or experiencing certain things, but those chemicals are not the same as the experience of that thing itself. Here's why science cannot analyze consciousness. You can only observe your own consciousness. You cannot observe anyone else's consciousness. For all you know, you could be a solipsist. For all you know, you might be the only person who exists because you cannot observe anyone else's consciousness. And science depends on observation. The scientific method depends on being able to observe things. So science cannot say anything about that which we cannot observe. And that is why science cannot answer the question of consciousness. So you could just say it's a mystery, but the only way to answer the question of consciousness is with some sort of supernatural metaphysical system that goes beyond what science itself can say. All right, now in A tier, we have the Transcendental Argument. This is articulated pretty well by people like J. Dyer, some of those Orthodox people, Eastern Orthodox. It's presuppositionalism, which is common in some parts of the Reformed tradition, is pretty similar to this. It basically says when people just think logically, there are a lot of assumptions they take for granted that they can't prove. Like, people assume that there is uniformity in nature. People assume that truth exists. There's a lot of assumptions that people make that they can't prove. You can't prove that truth exists. That's impossible. So these unproven assumptions make a lot more sense in a worldview where God exists and all of reality is upheld by the mind of God than in a worldview where God does not exist, and these assumptions are just human assertions that they're assuming without evidence. So that's basically the Transcendental Argument. My version of the Transcendental Argument is using the three Transcendentals: goodness, truth, and beauty. Truth is really the only one you could make an actual argument for. Goodness and beauty are just things that, I think are important to think about. The three Transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty. Jordan Cooper, very great Lutheran theologian, talks about this a lot. Goodness, truth, and beauty are all objective because they're all rooted in God's nature. That which is good is that which conforms to God's nature. That which is beautiful is that which conforms to God's nature. That which is true is that which conforms to God's nature. But goodness, truth, and beauty can only be objective if God exists, but everyone instinctively knows that goodness, truth, and beauty are objective, and especially truth. Because if truth is not objective, then the statement, truth is not objective, is that statement objectively true? If yes, objective truth exists. If it's not true, then objective truth exists. So I think you can argue just logically that objective truth exists, but I think because truth is one of those transcendentals, it cannot exist unless God exists. And I know you could pick that apart. There's criticisms of the Transcendental Argument. It's one of my personal favorites because I really do think that there are a lot of assumptions we take for granted. I really think that theology is the basis for science. That's why I prefer the Transcendental Argument to the Cosmological Argument. I don't think science leads us to God. I think God leads us to science because it really was the church that formed the basis for modern science. Yes, there was ancient Greek science, there was Islamic science, but modern science as we know it today was started by people who believed that the world was designed by an intelligent God, and that motivated them to study the world. Now, that doesn't, just because they believed that, doesn't mean God is real. It is possible that the church could have started science, and then science ends up undermining what the church believes. That's what Alex O'Connor said in response to me. That is a possibility. I'm just saying I like the Transcendental argument because I think these assumptions about God, I think theology precedes all the other sciences. Theology was called the queen of the sciences in the Middle Ages. So, yeah, I like that one. I also really like the ontological argument. Now, I don't use the ontological argument when I'm trying to talk to one of my unbelieving friends. If I talk to one of my unbelieving friends, I use the evidential argument and the moral argument. Because the ontological argument is very difficult to understand. It was articulated by Saint Anselm of Canterbury, and I think Anselm is one of the greatest theologians ever. I think he's my fourth favorite theologian behind Athanasius, Augustine, and John Calvin. St. Anselm was so based, he thought of so many cool things, and he founded medieval scholasticism. He disagreed with Thomas Aquinas, or rather Thomas Aquinas disagreed with him, because Aquinas was much later. Aquinas didn't like the ontological argument, but I favor Anselm over Aquinas. So the ontological argument basically says, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. If you think you can conceive of something greater than God, then that thing is God. Gavin Ortland has a great video on the ontological argument, which I highly recommend. Gavin Ortland from Truth Unites, another great YouTube pastor that I would highly recommend to everyone. So the ontological argument says God is defined as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Some people say it's the greatest possible being, but I think that than which nothing greater can be conceived is a better way to put it. And that means God is all-powerful, because a being who is all-powerful is greater than a being who is not all-powerful. It means God is all-good, because a being who is all-good is greater than a being who is not all-good. And it means that God exists, because a being that exists is greater than a being that doesn't exist. And you could say, just because we can think of such a being doesn't mean it actually exists. Well, actually, it does, because a being that exists in reality is greater than a being that exists in our mind. So there is such a thing as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now you could say, another response is, okay, what if I use this to argue for the existence of a perfect turtle or a self-existent pizza? What if I say, like, my perfect pizza is a pizza which no greater pizza can be conceived? Well, the problem with that is that the definition of pizza implies limitations. I made a funny line in my video about the arguments for God that people seem to think was funny. If your pizza gets infinitely great, it'll turn into God. If your pizza has infinite size, infinite power, and is eternal, a pizza of infinite size and infinite eternity and infinite power, that's not a pizza, that's God, okay? Same with the turtle. The definition of everything except God implies limitations. And there's been many, many different articulations of the ontological argument. There's Gödel's ontological argument with, like, mathematical proofs and stuff. I kind of understand it. I am a math student. That's mainly what I study. One day I hope to understand what he's trying to say. He uses, like, proofs logic about how certain things can be, like, vacuously true. I don't understand it enough to know if I like it or not. But generally speaking, the ontological argument is taken most seriously by mainstream philosophers of all the arguments for God. It's not that they necessarily believe in it. It's just the most well-respected, I believe. But now, in S tier, my favorite argument for God is the argument from mathematics. Now, I did admit that my video about responding to atheist arguments was a bad one. But I did make a different video about how math proves God, and a lot of atheists said that was bad. No, I stand by that one. There are things in mathematics that prove God beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond the slightest shadow of a doubt. Now, even if we didn't have things like the Mandelbrot set or Euler's identity, I think the fact that math contains infinite information proves the existence of an infinite mind to contain that infinite information. Like, there's an infinite number of numbers. Where is all that information stored? And you could say those numbers aren't actually all real. Those numbers are just things that we made up to explain the world, so there aren't actually an infinite number of numbers. There are only as many numbers as we can think of. But the thing that puts the nail in the coffin of that idea is the Mandelbrot set. The Mandelbrot set was clearly discovered by us. It was not invented by us. The debate in mathematics is whether math is invented or discovered. If it's invented, then that's not an argument for God, because math is just something we made. But if it's discovered, then who made math? And since math is infinite, then if it was created, it had to be created by an infinite being, if math is infinite, which math is infinite. So the Mandelbrot set, it's this shape with infinite complexity. It's not just one of those regular fractals where it repeats the same shape over and over again. The Mandelbrot set basically generates new complexity the more you zoom in on it, and you can zoom in forever and ever and ever, and you will never stop finding new things. Anytime you zoom in on the Mandelbrot set enough, you could see a shape that no human has ever seen before, and this shape is all generated by one simple equation. I don't like Answers in Genesis because they're young Earth creationists, but they do have a good video about how this really displays the infinite mind of God. Broken Clock is right twice a day. So, yeah, the mathematical argument is great. There's also Euler's identity. Euler's identity, it was discovered by Leonhard Euler, one of the greatest mathematicians ever, and he was a devout Calvinist like me, and he saw this as proof that God exists once he discovered it. There's like the 5 most important numbers in mathematics are 0, 1, e, I, and pi. For those of you who are not educated in math, e is a number that explains exponential functions because e to the x is the only equation that is its own derivative, the only non-trivial equation that is. And I is the basis for all the imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers aren't fake numbers. They're only called imaginary because they don't correspond to real things. Because you can say I have 3 apples. You can't say I have 3 apples. And of course, most people know what pi is. Pi is the number that explains both the area and a circumference of the circle. So there's pi, there's e, there's I. 1 is obviously one of the most important numbers because it's the basis for all real numbers. And 0 is actually a very important number because it wasn't until the, I think it was either the Islamic or the Indian mathematicians that discovered 0 that we were able to do algebra because 0 acts as a placeholder. So those 5 numbers, 0, I, e, 1, and pi, that was a weird order I said them in, all of them are connected by a beautiful equation, e to the power of pi times I plus 1 equals 0. And it is such a coincidence that they work together that way. And yes, once you understand the math behind it, once you understand complex numbers, complex analysis, you can see why it works. It's not like a complete coincidence. But the fact that it does work like that, the fact that math all fits together, and the more you study math, the more you see that it all fits together, that, I think, is indisputable proof of God. And I prefer to argue from math for God than to argue from science. Some people say math is a science. No, math is not a science. A science relies on evidence, observations, and experiments. Math relies on logical proof. I am a Platonist, a mathematical Platonist. I believe that mathematical truths are more real than physical truths. Because physical truths, every scientific experiment and observation is an approximation. It's never exact. But mathematics is exact. And I think we should argue for God based on mathematics and logic rather than trying to appeal to physical things. So that's my opinion, and that's my response to the crappy atheist video that I made that got lots of responses. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all later.